In response to my previous video, which was just on the definition of gender, the definitions of man and woman, what I think they should be, there were some commenters that talked about trans women competing in women's sports. It has literally no relevance whatsoever to my previous video, but it's a very popular talking point nowadays. The conversation has sort of died down lately, but it is nevertheless, in contemporary times, a popular talking point among right-wing transphobic people to bring up trans women competing in women's sports, because the transphobic people are trying to latch onto whatever they can. And this is something they can latch onto because there's a semblance, there's sort of an appearance of justice here. The idea is that cis women's rights are at risk because there's an actual relevance of someone's biological characteristics, of someone's sex at birth and the puberty they went through in a way that could potentially infringe on someone's rights. It's just an appearance, it's just an illusion. Ultimately, if you think about it further, you realize that actually it's trans people that are victims of injustice when it comes to sports. Nevertheless, because of the illusion of there being some sort of reasonableness to their position, they've decided to latch onto this as a relatively plausible propaganda point. So I'll address this propaganda point in this video and shatter the illusion and show that in fact it is not reasonable. This isn't even a nuanced or complex issue, but in fact it's pretty straightforward that trans inclusion in general and equality for trans people does imply that trans women have to be included in women's sports, that anything other than full inclusion of trans women in women's sports and trans men in men's sports and trans people in general in sports is transphobic and amounts to discrimination. I do think that there should be gender neutral sporting also, but in addition to men's and women's sports, I don't think all sports should be gender neutral. There should be men's, women's, and gender neutral sports. Participation in the men's and the women's category should be based on gender, which means gender identity and social role, and not based on sex, either your sex at birth or your current sex characteristics. So of the characteristics that I already mentioned, gender identity, sex, and so on, which one is relevant for dividing sports up if we're going to divide it at all? So first I want to consider the possibility of dividing sports up into categories based on sex at birth. People that are born female, born with female sex characteristics. I'm just going to say AFAB, AMAB. I know that people sometimes don't like that language, but it's the least problematic way of putting it. So I'm using right now AFAB and AMAB as terms of sex at birth, not as terms of gender assigned at birth. Although these two things are very closely correlated, but it's the sex at birth that's relevant for the purposes of what I'm saying. The difference between sex at birth and gender assigned at birth is the phrase gender assigned at birth describes something social. It's a description of how you were categorized into gender categories at the time you were born. Whereas sex at birth simply describes the fact of what physical characteristics somebody had at the time that they were born that are considered by scientists to be sex characteristics. The reason why we should not divide sports up into AFAB and AMAB, besides the fact that this is potentially exclusionary for intersex people, it is also an arbitrary classification. Why does it matter whether somebody was born with male characteristics or female characteristics? Why is that relevant as far as sports is concerned? You can't say, well, it's because this predicts their performance level. Because if performance level is the relevant thing, then why not just classify people by performance level? Why classify them based on what genitalia, etc. they were born with the assumption that they're going to have higher or lower performance level? Transphobic people have an ideology, this is their propaganda, that they really want to pin your gender to your sex at birth. Because their whole point is to invalidate trans people. That's the agenda behind all of this, right? They pretend to be scientific, they're actually pseudoscientific. They pretend to be concerned about women's rights, they couldn't care less. Not to mention that their position doesn't actually further women's rights. What's really going on is that they're trying to invalidate trans people. What's really going on is they're trying to marginalize and exclude trans people. And the way to do that, at least as far as the ideology part of it is concerned, is to basically promote the idea that your gender is determined by your sex at birth. There's no argument in defense of this position. This is not a plausible view. It's not commonsensically plausible. It's not scientifically plausible. And it's definitely not something that furthers social justice. It does not further inclusion of or equality for trans people whatsoever, or intersex people, or any group of people. But it is nevertheless really fiercely supported by right-wingers and transphobes, because the whole point is that they want trans people to be excluded. Going back to the topic at hand. So it is simply not relevant what someone's sex at birth is as a basis of dividing up sports. We don't even know whether this person actually went through the puberty associated with that sex, because not everybody does. We don't know exactly what the performance level is going to be. Now, what about if you divide it based on a person's current sex characteristics? Well, if you're dividing it based on a person's current sex characteristics, first of all, it's not clear how trans and intersex people even fall into this, because trans people can change their sex characteristics. And so what are you going to do? If there's a trans man taking testosterone, is he going to be classified as female or male? as for the purposes of sports, because he's got some male characteristics, he's got some female characteristics. But also, why classify sports based on a person's current sex characteristics? Why is that a relevant basis for classifying it? That's either as arbitrary or almost as arbitrary as classifying based on a person's sex at birth. If the issue is just performance, then you can just classify them based on performance level. You can't assume that if somebody has female secondary sex characteristics and primary sex characteristics, well, they're going to have a lower level of performance. It's not a guarantee at all. And that's not a social category, that's a biological category. And these two categories, of course, overlap. Most women do have certain biological characteristics, most men do have certain biological characteristics, but the biological characteristics themselves are not the social category. The social category is gender, and sports categories are socially salient as well. So why do we want to classify a social phenomenon, a social practice of sports according to something that isn't a social category? Why not categorize it then based on the color of someone's eyes? There's lots of different ways we can classify it. There's lots of biological characteristics people have that aren't sex characteristics. If the assumption is, well, the sex characteristics are relevant to performance, again, why not just classify people based on performance level then? So what about classifying sports just by performance category? There was a time when I thought this was the right way of dividing up sports. I have since come to the conclusion that this is not the right way of doing it. The reason this is not the right way of doing it is because there is a correlation between gender, which is a social category, and performance level in sports. As a group, men have higher levels of performance in sports than women do. To what extent is this for social reasons? To what extent is this for biological reasons? I don't know. But the point is the correlation does exist. And as long as this correlation exists, and as long as you have a bimodal distribution when it comes to gender, it's better to classify sports into men's and women's. And this way you will not have a situation where women end up being overrepresented in the lower performance brackets and men in the higher performance brackets, which is what would happen if you had all gender neutral sports. It protects women's ability to participate in sports to have a separate category for women. But you don't need a separate category for AFAB people in order to have that protection. Trans women constitute less than 1% of the population. If they are included in women's sports, even if trans women were in fact better at sports than cis women, which the data does not actually support. If you look at the evidence based on what I've seen so far anyway, I'm not a scientist or an expert on this, but as a layperson, what I've seen is that there is no significant difference in performance level between trans women and cis women. And so this is certainly the case with trans women that have transitioned hormonally. But even if we assume that there is some difference, if you consider both the fact of the number of trans women versus the number of cis women, as well as the fact that trans women live as women in society, tend to look like women, and have psychological characteristics of women, namely female gender identity, that's a relevant characteristic for defining their gender, then it makes more sense to treat those trans women as exceptional women rather than to treat them as average men or men who have lower than average performance level, because of the fact that they have other characteristics, social and psychological, in common with women. In any case, their performance level is closer to the female range, but even if it wasn't, since they have the social and psychological characteristic in common, it makes more sense to classify them with women than it does to classify them with men. Trans women will be discriminated against if they're forced to compete with men because their performance level, and this is proven, is lower than that of cis men on average. And on top of that, they're very small in number by comparison with cis men. So they're going to be at a systematic disadvantage if they're competing against men. On top of that, because of the fact that they look like women, live like women, you're going to end up in a situation where they're going to be humiliated, they're going to feel awkward, they're going to look awkward, everyone else is going to feel awkward. You're going to have, men's cricket match between Pakistan and India, let's say, and you have all these men there, and then you have this one woman on the team, on the Pakistan team, let's say. I mean, that's just going to be a ridiculous situation. It's going to look like a woman and so on. It's not going to fit, and it's going to effectively exclude her from the ability to have a career in sports. And so clearly, social and psychological characteristics are relevant because sports itself is a social practice. And so we do need to take into consideration whether some characteristic is socially salient or not. Having a separate category of sports for trans people is also the wrong policy. There's simply not enough trans people for this to be logistically feasible at all. And it's going to amount to there simply not being any trans people competing in sports, so there being very, very minimal participation of trans people in sports, and trans people are effectively going to be excluded. On top of that, it further marginalizes and otherizes trans people to push them into the separate category and say, well, you do your little sports over there while the normal people and the grown-ups are doing their sports over here. It just further reinforces the idea that trans people are not part of mainstream society, that they're not men or women in any case, and they constitute as some separate group of weird people that should just do their own separate thing or their thing away from everybody else. The only way to divide up sports that actually balances out these different things, that balances out inclusion for cis women, inclusion for trans people, is to have sports divided into men's, women's, and gender neutral, and have participation in the men's sports based on gender identity and social role. In other words, based on a person being a man. Participation in the women's also based on gender identity, social role, based on a person being a woman, and the gender neutral sport is open for everybody. I think the real difficulty actually arises with non-binary and genderqueer athletes. That's where you have potentially a challenge, because that's a situation where you have to judge on a case-by-case basis. That's my solution there. I don't have a general solution. Their social social characteristics, to their bodily characteristics, as well as their own preference, what they want. But there is potentially a challenge that comes with that. There's no challenge when it comes to trans women competing in women's sports. Of course they should be. I think it goes without saying that trans women should be included in women's sports, and I have not heard a single convincing argument for why they shouldn't be. Even in the instance that you have a trans woman who's quite good and defeats cis women in some instances, it's a chivalry bias that leads to people having a problem with this other than transphobia. You will sometimes have these feminine cis het women, athletes who have lost to a trans woman, who weaponize chivalry bias by crying, on the TV and talking about how a biological man went and stole their title or unfairly beat them. And this is especially so in combat sports because, of course, nothing triggers chivalry bias more than situations in which you have potentially men being violent against women. When I say chivalry bias, I don't mean it necessarily in a negative sense. I just mean that it's a certain attitude that we have when it comes to gender. I'm using bias in a neutral sort of sense, that there's this gender bias that women should be protected in a way that men should not be, that women are vulnerable. And this bias does exist in human nature. It is part of our psychology that we tend to see women as more needing protection and deserving protection than men. Trans women become associated with men based on their sex at birth, and so they're like a biological man. There's no such thing as a biological man. Just in case anyone didn't know, there's no such thing as a biological man or a biological woman. These terms, biological man and biological woman, are not even coherent terms. They're nonsensical at a semantic level. The term biological cannot modify the term woman or man. To say that someone is a biological man is like saying they're a biological citizen. Man and woman are social categories. The word biological doesn't modify terms for social categories. It's nonsensical. Let's say someone's an American. Would it make any sense to ask a person, but are you a biological American though? Like, it's just a ridiculous way of speaking. It's still misgendering the trans person big time because you're still saying that they belong to that gender. For example, if you call a trans man a biological woman, you are saying he's a woman because a biological woman is a type of woman. A black woman is a type of woman. A Pashtun woman is a type of woman. A lesbian woman is a type of woman, and so on. Similarly, a biological woman, if there was such a thing, would be a type of woman because the word woman occurs there. It basically is saying you are a woman but in a biological way as opposed to some other way of being a woman. And that is horse shit. Trans men are not women and trans women are not men, therefore they cannot be biological women or biological men. And so there's transphobic propaganda. When cis women athletes participate in it, they will tend to be like, oh, I got beaten by a biological man who was very strong. And it's basically just trying to get people to feel sorry for her because she's feminine and because she's a woman. It's not any worse for a cis woman to get beaten in a sport where the point is to beat people, like boxing or MMA or whatever, a combat sport, than it is for her to get beaten by a cis woman. If you're against combat sports existence, and that's a different issue, then you should just say, oh, combat sports in general shouldn't exist for anyone. I'm not against the existence of combat sports as long as they don't exceed some level of violence. In the case of combat sports, you could add a requirement that if you have a trans woman, even this, I'm not totally sure about it, but it's something to consider, that you could have a requirement that if you have a trans woman who is participating in a combat sport, that there should be an informed consent model, that whoever her potential opponent is, this is true regardless if her potential opponent is another trans woman or is a cis woman, they should know that this person is a trans woman, and then they can make a decision whether they want to participate in the match or not. The reason I don't think there should be a testosterone limit is because it's not consistent with the general idea of competition in sports. We want people to be good at sports, right? That's the reason why they train. That's the reason why they're careful about their diet and so on. The whole point is to reward good performance. It doesn't make sense that when the good performance can potentially be linked with testosterone, then we punish it and we want people to actually be worse. So we're like, let's take running. Run faster, be good at running. Wait, you're too good at running. Run slower, okay? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Like, which one is it? We're sending mixed messages here. Once we have this division into men's and women's categories, within that category, there's no reason to discourage somebody from being good. Whether it's the testosterone that's making them good, or whether it's the amount of hours they trained, or their diet, the coaching they have access to, some other genetic or biological factor other than testosterone. It doesn't matter what it is as long as they're not cheating. It's not cheating, obviously, just exists as a trans woman that just naturally has a certain testosterone. We're not talking about doping here. In the case of trans men will be taking many trans men take exogenous testosterone, and that will probably improve the performance, although the link between testosterone and performance is not so established as how people will often assume. In the popular imagination, people will often think, because they associate performance in sports with men, and they associate testosterone with manliness and manhood, so they're like, oh, I guess testosterone like makes you a man and makes you good at sports. It's not necessary, but in any case, trans men do often take exogenous testosterone, but that brings their testosterone within the male range. Also, it's by prescription anyway. Specifically, it is gender affirming healthcare, and that absolutely has to be allowed, and trans men cannot be excluded from sports based on this, for the simple reason that that's discrimination against trans men. So I'm talking about trans men competing in the men's category. I'm not talking about trans men competing in the women's category. And I already gave an argument for why gender identity and social role are the relevant relevant characteristics when we're talking about dividing up sports. Well, they're relevant. The performance level is also relevant, but the performance level is relevant. The performance level of men and women as a group, that is relevant. It is one of the reasons why I believe there should be a division in the first place, but it's only relevant in conjunction with the socially salient nature of these identities, or the socially salient nature of gender. So to summarize, there should be 3 categories of sports: men's, women's, and gender neutral. Men's and women's should be divided based on gender, that is gender identity and social role, and not divided based on sex at birth or even the type of puberty people go through. And the reason why it should be divided this way is because sports is a social practice and social categories such as gender are relevant. On top of that, there's a correlation between performance level and gender, with men on average having higher performance level than women on average, and there's no systematic threat to women's sports from trans women due to the fact that trans women are a very small percentage of the population compared to cis women. But there is a systematic threat to trans women in forcing them to compete with cis men, or forcing them to compete in a separate category for trans women or a separate category for trans people. So if you balance out the rights and the aim of including cis women and trans people, this balances out those aims in the best way. The other ones end up either excluding trans people, or in one instance excluding women in general, including cis women and trans women.